Colorado versus Colorado State, U of A versus ASU, and what's the difference between Ohio University and The Ohio State University? If you're familiar with the post-secondary education system in the United States, then the terms state college or state university might also be familiar to you. For most people outside the US, and if we're being honest, to some people inside the states as well, then you might be curious why some states have both a university of and a state university. After all, why does Washington need two separate schools named after the state? Why do some states only have one? Why are they almost exclusively in two separate parts of the same state? Today we're here to explore these questions, and most importantly, discuss why some schools are called the U, and why some schools are just called state. So, what's the difference? Of the 50 states that make up good ol' America, all but 2 have schools titled University of said state. One could argue a case for New Jersey, given that Rutgers is technically the state's official university, but in the case of New York, it's a massive can of worms that would deserve its own video. A few less states have named state universities, with systems existing in 38 states, excluding Alaska, Hawaii, Wyoming, Nebraska, Wisconsin, Maryland, Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and again New Jersey. I've also excluded Connecticut, which has 4 state schools which are technically location-based, but I have included Virginia, which is technically a commonwealth, and therefore VCU counts. Like most colleges and universities in the United States, the vast majority of these schools were founded between the years 1830 and 1910, in an era of history we can very broadly call the United States Age of Expansion. During this time, the country that started on the Atlantic coast was gradually expanding west, first through the purchasing of unincorporated territory from European powers, then through the reorganizing of these territories into federal states. As the governments of these new states was being reorganized, so too were their education systems, specifically their higher education systems, which is why you tend to see the founding of a state's named university very soon before or after its admission into statehood. Now here's where it gets interesting. While settlers moved west into new states, a distinct educational divide began to spread between those living in the state's urban centers and those who were settling the land through homesteads. This was based on one specific aspect of state education. While the majority of homesteaders moving west were living on farms and in need of agricultural education, the state-funded universities were more often than not still following the traditional East Coast Oxford model. These universities almost exclusively taught liberal arts courses. To solve this rift in educational provision, Congress passed the Land Grant Act of 1862, where federal funds were allocated to each state in order to pay for agricultural or technological education. In some cases, like with Rutgers or the University of Illinois, states recycled these funds into already existing institutions. But for most states west of Ohio, specifically those yet to gain statehood, these funds were used to establish entirely new schools, often in small towns central to the developing agricultural societies of these new states. With the name University of already taken by the now exclusively liberal arts schools in each state, most of these schools utilize their focus on agricultural, mechanical, or technological sciences in their names, which is where we get the terms A&M or A&T. Using my home state of North Dakota as an example, the separation of liberal arts and agricultural education between state schools is why, even today, UND is home to the state medical, pre-dental, and law programs, while the vast majority of mechanical engineering, agriculture, and rural biology programs are housed at NDSU. Though education is obviously the primary focus of most universities, the turn of the century brought about a massive change for national schools in the form of college sports. In-state rivalries between the area's liberal arts and A&M colleges brought about the rise of such feuds as Michigan State, Washington State, Texas A&M, etc., all of which are mostly intact to this day with the exception of conference divides. Mascots were uncommon prior to the popularization of college football, though as the wave of change circled the nation, the traditionally older liberal arts colleges claimed the state's common nickname. The Badger State gave rise to the Wisconsin Badgers. The Wolverine State brought about the Michigan Wolverines. A notable exception is Ohio State, who claimed the Buckeye State over Ohio University's eventual nickname of the Bobcats. Leaving the A&M schools without a popular choice, several athletic programs embraced their agricultural roots, adopting the nickname Aggies, used throughout the years and into the present by such schools as Utah State, New Mexico State, Texas A&M, North Carolina A&T, Colorado State, Louisiana State, Mississippi State, Michigan State, and even the likes of UMass and UConn. By the mid-20th century, school funding and enrollment throughout the United States was outpacing the state's schools' need for specialized education. And the expansion of liberal arts and technological programs at opposite schools made the A&M naming convention rapidly outdated. As a result, the overwhelming majority of state agricultural schools began shortening their official names from State Ag and Tech to simply just State, which is where the difference between university and state university comes from. Now, obviously, there are exceptions to this rule. Most sets of schools that follow the liberal arts versus ag tech convention are located in the Midwest and far west of the United States, where they would have fallen in line with the expansion history we just detailed. In the Northeast, most states were either not large enough or already developed enough to not require specialized agricultural programming, or in some cases, the state-named universities were old enough to have already included these programs from the times of their founding in colonial America. The most obvious exception to this rule comes in the American South, where the separation of university and state university comes from a much more dramatic historical explanation. When the Land Grant Act was passed in 1862, the southern United States were distracted by something else to really need educational reform. Regardless of the fact that most of these states predated the expansion era, it wasn't until after the old swingin' 60s that the South was in need of educational reform. It was in need of quite a lot of reform, actually. Even after the old fight for freedom, the majority of state-named universities in the South remained segregated until the 1960s. During the near 100 years between legal freedom and social freedom for African Americans prior to the passing of the Civil Rights Act, the need for black post-secondary education resulted in the establishment of privately funded minority-centric universities, today referred to as historically black colleges. As a result, 7 states in the American South, those being Alabama, Delaware, Kentucky, South Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia, all have their state universities categorized as historically black, with an additional 5 states and the District of Columbia having state-named schools or A&M schools associated as historically black. So there you have it. In short, the university of a state is historically focused on liberal arts education, whereas the state university is historically focused on agriculture and technology, which is also why a large number of state universities once boasted athletic programs with the nickname Aggies. This history is true throughout the country except the Northeast and the American South, with the former seeing a large number of states without named state universities, and the latter boasting state universities which are historically black. Did you learn anything? Find an error in my lesson? Anything I left out you want me or anyone else watching this video to know? Drop a comment in the section below. Make sure to like, share, and or subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and take a peek at the playlist on the bottom corner of your screen for more college and college sports content. But until next time, hope to see you very, very soon.